I mean, I'm not so sure about the Stoics. As I said, the Stoics tended to try and ease people's death anxiety. It was all about sort of eliminating suffering and explaining how it's all in your control. Whether you decide to let something bother you and cause anxiety in you is exactly in your head. So you're in command of whether you feel pain or these kinds of things. So they were very good at coming up with arguments for why we don't have to worry about death. And there's classic ones like, well, you didn't exist before your birth. Does that feel bad? No, it doesn't feel bad. Well, that's going to be exactly the same condition as after you die. It's not going to feel bad. So don't worry about it.
If I could just start by referencing your book, Life is Short, which is probably a response to the Stoic philosopher Seneca's terrific book from 2000 years ago now, on the shortness of life. And in that book, he says that it's not that we have a short life to live, but that we waste an awful lot of it. Now, you tend to disagree with that idea, or that notion of wasting our lives in your book. Can you explain?
Well, it's not so much that I disagree with the wasting of our lives idea. It's the idea that death is not particularly important. For the Stoics, the whole idea of how they face death is to sort of dismiss it and minimize its importance. So I kind of tend to agree with Seneca that we waste it. And in this book, sort of my view of death is my answer to Seneca. And the idea is that death is the thing that forces you to take notice of how you are wasting your time. It sort of channels your efforts and your sort of missions in a more productive way. If death wasn't there, if the threat of death and that sort of flashing sign wasn't there, you just wouldn't be quite so motivated to focus on certain tasks and challenges and making yourself better and all of the things that you have to do in a life. You'd be sitting around wasting time. So it's more of an addition to Seneca's book. There's lots that I agree with in Seneca's book. What I try to do in my book is modernize it a bit in the light of new developments. Disagree with a few things here and there, but mostly I agree with it. And I think it's still an amazing book and still very relevant. Now you can read it and it's exactly the same kinds of issues as we have today.
Well, just as an extension then from that, your book opens with a reference to the unlimited possibilities not being suited to mankind or humankind. Can you explain what you mean by that, the notion of unlimited possibilities and that they aren't suited to us?
Yeah, I mean, it's related to what I just said about the role of having these boundaries. And obviously death is like the major boundary. So and like some of the chapters, I play around with this idea of, well, what happens if you start moving this death boundary and you start imagining you expanding your lifespan until you become literally immortal? And the way I view that is it's almost, my background's in physics. So I make a sort of comparison to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which most people know now because it's in all the movies. The idea is that whenever there's a decision to make in the world, usually we think you choose one and then the other one doesn't happen, right? If you choose one, the other one, that's eliminated, it's gone. Many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics says, it's in the context of physics experiments usually, but it says something like, when you make a decision and you choose one alternative, the other one happens as well. So if everything's happening, well, in that sense, you're not really choosing anything. There's no actual event happening. And in the same way, if we are not limited, then all possibilities are open to us. We're not having to choose and decide particular paths through our life, through possibility space. Because, I mean, what is it that makes us? It's these decisions that we've made, the important decisions are the ones that most importantly define us. Whether we marry, whether we have kids, what particular job we have. So if you imagine taking that away so that none of it matters because you can marry everyone eventually, you can do everything eventually, then nothing has that kind of meaning anymore.
So there's no risk reward then. Is that what you're trying to say then? There's no
risk is a good way of putting it. Like the way I put it in the book is sacrifice. you're not having to sacrifice certain things for other things. So nothing really has the same kind of value in a world where you're not limited. If you're unlimited, then the things you choose don't have value because you can choose something else later on. There's always the possibility of doing the opposite, doing something completely different. So it's in this kind of sacrificial, I mean, each big decision is really like a sacrificial offering. You are sacrificing those other possibilities of how you could be and how you could develop. So it's significant. And that's what I argue in the book, where the meaning, or at least some source of meaning, comes from in our lives. Like, in fact, I think a very big source of meaning for our lives is the fact that we've got that death facing us in the future. So we're forced to make important decisions. And they're the things that make our life what it is and make it meaningful.
So the sword of Damocles that is death, the inevitable, is hanging over us, and that gives value to things and meaning and purpose to the things that we do, the choices that we make.
Exactly. We think of it as this awful, terrible thing. I mean, a lot of, ancient philosophers used to think of it as evil, basically, that death was a source of evil in the world. But seriously, if you imagine taking death away, and lots of people these days, with this transhumanism and the singularity and uploading your brain into a computer, there's lots of sort of moves towards immortality these days, and I don't think it's a good thing, because I think it forgets about this particular role that death plays. And I've been thinking recently, in fact, that if we do manage to do this, I mean, it's possible that we can simulate our entire brains, or in some way get immortality, right? It's possible that if we do this, then we're going to be forced into almost simulating death experiences to try and push meaning back into our lives, right? If we had a simulation where we're inside the simulation, we would go out of our minds, and we would end up having to simulate something similar, some boundaries and limits and obstacles, in order to sort of stay sane and have meaningful existences within this immortal existence.
Do you think the discussion and the conversation around death has moved on appreciably at all in the 2000 years since Seneca lived? We've experienced so much in terms of human development and technological development, and there has been that experiential accumulation over the generations, and in every other aspect of life and science in particular. So we are now more civilized and more developed, and I use that in inverted commas, than, let's say, our ancestors might have been 2000 years ago. But when it comes to discussions over things, really big, weighty subjects like death, do the Stoics have just as much insight as we do today?
I mean, I'm not so sure about the Stoics. As I said, the Stoics tended to try and ease people's death anxiety. It was all about sort of eliminating suffering and explaining how it's all in your control. Whether you decide to let something bother you and cause anxiety in you is exactly in your head. So you're in command of whether you feel pain or these kinds of things. So they were very good at coming up with arguments for why we don't have to worry about death. And there's classic ones like, well, you didn't exist before your birth. Does that feel bad? No, it doesn't feel bad. Well, that's going to be exactly the same condition as after you die. It's not going to feel bad. So don't worry about it. So this is why this is where I do disagree. Going back to the beginning, why I do disagree with the Stoics, because it's not, you can't just dismiss it like that. That takes away the importance. That there's a reason we have death in the universe, and I think the reason is precisely to sort of imbue our lives with meaning in this way. So now going back to the question you just asked, whether sort of recent developments, whether things have changed with our attitudes towards death, that probably depends on whether you're religious or not. Because I would imagine a lot of religious people, they're just not concerned with all of these developments that I mentioned about transhumanism and the technologies that can increase life and these kind of things, because they already know, or they already feel like that they're going to be going somewhere else afterwards. So they have their anxiety eased in that way. So obviously what's changed is that there are far less, I would imagine there are far fewer people that are religious now. So I would imagine that death anxiety has skyrocketed in the in the last 100 years or so. This is probably why all of this new technology has come about. It's sort of been forced to replace the vacuum that this religious kind of viewpoint has left in its wake. If you remove this idea of an afterlife, then you're left with a state of terror. So you either go toward the Stoics and say, okay, we don't have to worry about it because I'm probably not going to be in pain and that's fine and I won't feel it. Or you can go towards the transhumanists and try and get your mind around the possibility of your brain being frozen or something, and then reanimated with new technologies in the future so that you'll never die. So it's a different way of dealing with these. It's all a way of dealing with death anxiety. And I don't think that the ways of dealing with it have changed.
I'm glad you introduced the subject of religion. I was going to introduce it at some point. I saw a very interesting quote from Carl Sagan, and he said, the suppression of uncomfortable ideas may be common in religion or in politics, but it is not the path to knowledge, and there is no place for it in the endeavor of science. Now, you're a man of science. Can you relate to what Carl Sagan is saying there?
Yes, but I think he's a popular science man, and popular scientists tend to oversell what science can do. Obviously, the things science can do well, religion can't do well, and spiritual beliefs can't do well. But the things science doesn't do well, namely things to do with meaning, religion and spirituality can do well. So they're sort of complementary. Each one scores where the other one fails, and vice versa. So
are people of faith, when it comes to the subject of death and that uncomfortable truth that Sagan refers to there, are people of faith at an advantage in the sense that they have that notion of death tied up in a nice, neat little bow, and it makes that uncomfortable truth for some people a very comfortable reality for them, whereas people who don't have faith or atheists are facing that void and accepting the fact in their own minds that nothing exists for them afterwards. Does that give, it's a complex question, I suppose, but does that give them an urgency to enjoy and make life more meaningful for them where they are alive? Whereas the counter to that would be then people of faith then would be less urgent in the sense that while the everlasting life is a comfortable future for them, but they lack the urgency to live life because they know there's going to be something following life for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, so it's possible that religious people will be more relaxed in their attitudes towards their endeavors. I mean, that has benefits in how you are actually engaging with life. There's not necessarily anything bad with taking a relaxed approach to life. So in this book, I'm not saying absolutely pack everything in that you can, and because that's sort of not living either. That's like in a state of mania. It's about sort of being just a bit more mindful in your choices. And remember that the religious people still know that they're going to die in this life, and there's going to be something very different. They don't know what it is. So they still have to make their wise choices here. And probably they will have the same sort of focus on making them very, very wise choices, because they've got these other ideas of, well, I need to sort of act accordingly because there may be some conditions on my getting into this afterlife, or I might be placed elsewhere first before getting in purgatory or something like that. So it's a different way of they still have the urgency in terms of living mindfully, but they're certainly a hell of a lot more relaxed, and they don't have this fear of death. I mean, I've met lots of them, and they seem very at ease with the whole business of death. And it's thing is although it's not the same as religion, Buddhists tend to be absolutely terrified of death. And what you see in Buddhism is they are so absolutely terrified of death that they try and almost bring about the state of death before actually dying. So they're so terrified of death that they don't live. They have very strange kinds of existence where it's all about annihilating ahead of time rather than living and having different kinds of experiences. So I find it's a curious one. I mean, I'm quite critical in the book, a little bit critical in the book of Buddhism, because it's almost like escaping from the challenge of life and sort of facing it and living mindfully, even though they think of it as mindfulness. It's a strange way of being, in my view.
Living purposefully and living with intent is very much living focused on the now. Would you agree with that contention?
Not so much, actually. So, a lot of books have come out recently, for a while now, about living in the now and being present and all this kind of thing. Obviously, it's very good to be aware of your settings and these kind of things. But what the argument I make in the book is that there's a sort of balancing act that you have to do between past, present, and future. So I sort of point out the various pitfalls of being too past focused, where you get anxieties and you're dwelling and these kind of things, which I would associate with the Senex viewpoint, the old man viewpoint. So if you're focusing too much on the past or too much on the future and planning, then you're not quite living. It's always living for something else. But then if you're too much in the present, then you're also forgetting that there are things that will happen in the future that you have to plan for, and that you are being built by your past experiences. So you need to be mindful of what kind of past experiences are going to be left back there that are constructing your upcoming present moments. You want those upcoming present moments to be filled with good things, filled with meaningful things. So you have to stack the right experiences behind you in order to build better present experiences. So I don't like this idea of just saying, oh, let's just be in the present moment and the flow. To a certain extent, yes, but you have to still have one eye forwards and another eye backwards, this sort of Janus-faced kind of position. So it's this very fine balancing act, which Seneca, I will say, Seneca doesn't get that in his book either. So he's very much sort of grasp it now, seize the day, typical kind of Stoic person, which I'm not so impressed with, actually.
And so then can you define for me then the difference between living and then existing? Does that then refer then to, as an extension to what you said, does that refer to looking and appreciating what you're doing now, but also appreciating what came and what will come in the future?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, Seneca's great on this point. He has this very nice metaphor of imagining a sailor who sets out to sea. But instead of going on a journey, he's just getting thrown around by the waves and doesn't make it out of port. So he's existing, but it's not actually a journey. He didn't actually do anything. The metaphor, the example I use, which I prefer, comes from Jung's, C.G. Jung's, the psychologist's approaches of provisionality. And so what I've done in the book is connect it to this notion of a puer aeternus. So a puer aeternus means eternal child in Latin. And the idea that there is the provisional life consists of never making an actual decision. So you mentioned earlier this opening line about, we're not suited to the unlimited situations. Well, the puer aeternus wants to live in an unlimited way. And to do that, they will never make a decision and never forge a path. So the whole of the possibility space is constantly open up before them. But they're not living because they're not actualizing events. They're not choosing things, making decisions, making themselves a particular kind of person that's forged by their particular kinds of decisions. So they live provisionally in a kind of virtual state where nothing is ever actualized. So this is what Jung means by the provisional life. They never settle into anything. I think this is sort of the modern condition. The condition of modern humans is they are very provisional. There's very little settling going on. Everything's virtual. Nothing is real, basically. And then with the metaverse, this whole business of the metaverse now, we're going even more down this path of provisionality where nothing is real, because the decisions you make, they might have some consequences, but they're not the sort of real life consequences of having real life relationships, doing real life experiences and these kinds of things.
How much are we struggling now, though, from the paradox of choice, though, which will affect the provisionality that you're talking about.
Yeah, this was a good question. Like Chris Williamson mentioned this point, and it's a good point. I mean, it's true we have so many options, and with the internet we have insane options in terms of the information we can take in, and it's hard to filter. It's hard to filter through this many options. I think the example Chris gave was of going into a clothes shop, going to try and choose some clothing, and it used to be the case that you went and there was like two pairs of jeans, two choices of pairs of jeans, and it was like this one or this one, easy. And now we've got like how many different fits, boot, all the different kinds of styles of jeans, and it's harder to make a decision. But I mean, I suppose this is why it's harder to make a decision. And then this is no doubt why most people let other people make their decisions for them. So they will look to what other people are doing online, on social media, and they will construct themselves sort of mimetically by copying. So then you end up with a bunch of people who are sort of behaving identically and dressing identically, which is enforced even more so by these social media. And one of the things I also discuss in the book is this, it's to do with the living intentionally thing. You can either, again, it goes back to an example of C.G. Jung. It's kind of like being a cork being bobbed around in an ocean, right? You're not deciding where your movements go and where you end up. It's just like this wave of the social media and what everybody else is doing and what's on the internet that's moving you along and making your decisions. So the reason why I mention individuation and C.G. Jung in the book is this idea of trying to figure out what it is that makes you, you. And this whole business of, it's like the classic thing at the moment, living authentically, so that your decisions are coming from something a little bit deeper inside you rather than being made by elsewhere. As you say, it's difficult because there's so much choice, but I don't know, it's a bit of a battle, and it's a much harder battle for people today, and especially young people, than it used to be. I can't imagine growing up as a kid in this environment and sort of keeping my identity. It would be very hard, I think.
You mentioned a couple of things there: the puer aeternus, the eternal boy, or the Peter Pan syndrome, and also making decisions and making choices. How much of living purposefully is linked to taking responsibility for your life and the choices and the decisions that you make?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, and it links to the provisional life. One of the reasons why people like living provisionally is because it's comfortable, and it's comfortable because you don't have to make decisions. And if you don't have to make decisions, you don't need to take responsibility. If that decision goes wrong, blows up in your face, or anything like that. So it's a sort of a retreat from responsibility. So that's sort of the characteristic of the puer aeternus, is precisely that, the retreat from responsibility and taking action. But if you don't take responsibility, if you're not acting and you're not taking responsibility for your actions, you are certainly not living purposefully. And you're not, I would argue, living really in reality at all. This is what the provisional life is. You're living in a sort of virtual reality. You're not choosing, because if you choose, you have to take responsibility. And taking responsibility is what characterizes being an adult. Hence, they're eternal children, Peter Pan people.
And do you think, you mentioned not the fact that you'd hate to be a young person living now, do you think that we are engaging as a society, in particular younger generations now, are really throwing themselves headfirst into the, I'm trying to think of the word for it, but the into distraction and into using technology and just really throwing themselves into certain aspects of life whereby they're not confronting responsibility and they're not confronting awareness, and they're getting further away from accepting the potential reality that there is nothing after you die?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the reasons for that particular behavior has anything to do with death. I think it's more a case of the technology taking away the ability just to be still and think. There was this, I remember when people started first writing about this, the distraction business, and there was the guy, Nicholas Carr, has this book, The Shallows, from a while back. And the idea there was that, with all of this social media, and they're constantly being fed these messages. If you see one of my kids' phones is just constantly bipping with new messages. You cannot be still with this level of distraction. And it's not an anxiety that has led them there. I think a lot of it is the technologies have led them to the anxiety, and they have this feeling that they need to be constantly hooked into this thing because they'll miss out on something. And this is causing the distraction. And I don't really know what you do about this other than sort of trying to create at least some kind of times and spaces where there is no distraction. They should be doing meditations at school. They should certainly not be allowing the kids to have phones in schools, which I know many schools allow this. There should be some time to think about who you are. It doesn't involve being told who you are by all of these other influences.
You've said already that you're not a fan of the concept of focusing on the now. Does that mean you're not necessarily a fan of a greater degree of self-awareness? And I'm talking in relation to, let's say, automatic patterns of thought and feeling and behavior.
No. So yeah, I was going to say, look, it's not that I'm not a fan of this idea of being in the now. It's that to the exclusion. I'm not a fan of the idea that you should be that to the exclusion of past and future. So, look, part of the whole point of the book and the individuation chapters is to absolutely get this notion of self-awareness built up to an extreme degree, so that all of your unconscious drivers that you are not aware are bouncing you around like the cork on the ocean, which is another force that's pushing you around. Bring all of those up to the surface so that you are fully aware of what you're seeing, why you're having the thoughts that you're having. And it's almost a hyper awareness that I would advocate, which is being even outside of your ego and yourself so that you can watch. That's the whole point of individuation. Try and watch what your ego does, how it responds to particular influences. What happens when you get a piece of praise? What does the ego do? How does it move? What happens when you get criticized? What happens when you meet some frustration somewhere? Where's it coming from? So unless you get a grip on this, you can't be purposeful in your future actions, and you can't be purposeful in building the past that builds the person that you want to be. So it's sort of this, you're pointing in many directions at once, and you're stepping back from your ego and from yourself, is sort of the position I would look for. I would try and advocate.
So the present moment, then, if my interpretation of what you're saying is correct, the present moment is part of a continuum with the past behind us, but not so far behind us that we've disconnected from it, and in advance of the future, which is just there within our grasp. The present moment is part of that continuation, really.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, you shouldn't, although it's nice to be in these flow states that people often talk about. If you're sort of building the skill set, if you're building up the person that you want to be, you can't always be in the flow state. So what you want is to sort of be building the future that you want yourself to be. So it's almost, so the present moment. So the idea is that you have to step outside almost that present moment, so you can see the present and the past and the future and your ego and how it sits in that little spot in the present moment.
It's really interesting you mentioned ego there, because last week or the week before, I reviewed Ryan Holiday's Ego is the Enemy. And I had never read a book, first of all, about ego, but I didn't appreciate just how significant the ego can be to our existence. It's fascinating.
Yeah, he's I know, I remember I was reading those Ryan Holiday books a while back, and he has one very similar in terms of the limit, called the what is it, the obstacle
is the way. Yep.
That very similar idea that you need these you need limits to push against. if you didn't have them, you wouldn't be forced into action. It's a very similar idea. And I like that book. And I like the one you mentioned, the ego is the enemy as well. It's very similar sort of mindset.
And again, he's somebody who very much is fascinated with the Stoic philosophers, and with the with philosophy handed down 2,000 years ago. It's really remarkable for me, I think, at this stage, as I alluded to it earlier, that in 2023, the conversation in relation to the human existence, and certainly in relation to death, really hasn't developed beyond what we were talking about all those centuries ago, and that it is the definition of the human experience that we still have to arrive at our own individual conclusion as to what we believe life and death is.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's really, a lot of what happens is always old wine in new bottles, but it has to happen, right? So Ryan Holiday is basically just doing the same thing. It's the Stoics again, but it already happened also in the sort of 1700s, and you have Montaigne in his essays who's doing it again, and it just keeps re-rising, and people need to sort of present it again, because these are the archetypal timeless truths, clearly. But archetypes aren't enough information. You need to clothe them in the correct sort of clothing for the day. So what Ryan Holiday's doing, what I'm trying to do, is clothe all of these important old lessons that we've known forever in sort of modern terminology that will fit. And what I like about the way that Ryan Holiday does it, and there's a few others, is that it's exactly what is needed for sort of modern man. So it's usually when there's a crisis. There's a crisis in masculinity, and you hear all these things about toxic masculinity. Stoicism and these ideas are exactly the appropriate corrective for not having inadequate men, really, inadequate males. It's exactly what is needed, I think. And it's interesting that it crops up at exactly the right time. And it seems to always happen like this.
Well, your book, Life is Short, is a very interesting read, and certainly a sobering read, as is the subject of life and death, and how we interpret our position in the world, and how we interpret what is going to happen after us, after we die, and how we get most value and purpose out of life. I highly recommend people read it. Dean Rickles, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. It's been a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, thanks. It was good chat.